Rome's conquest of Dacia is usually remembered as one of Trajan's greatest victories. The Dacian kingdom was defeated, its capital was destroyed, its territory was absorbed into the Roman Empire, and for a time, the conquest delivered exactly what Rome wanted. A powerful rival north of the Danube had ceased to exist as an independent kingdom. But that is only the first half of the story. The more interesting question is what Rome had to do after it won. For decades, Dacia had been more than another neighboring kingdom. Under Decebalus, it had developed into a capable power on the northern side of the Danube, in a region that directly affected the security of Rome's frontier. Earlier Roman attempts to contain the problem had produced settlements rather than a permanent solution. The result was an uneasy relationship in which Rome had to tolerate an independent power it could not fully control. Trajan chose a different answer. Instead of preserving Dacia as a subordinate buffer, Rome destroyed the kingdom and turned its territory into a province. That decision solved one problem immediately. There was no longer an independent Dacian state capable of pursuing its own strategy on Rome's frontier. But conquest also changed the nature of the problem. Before the war, Rome had to deal with Dacia. After the war, Rome had to defend Dacia. That distinction is crucial. Capturing territory is a military achievement. Holding it is a long-term institutional commitment. Once Dacia became Roman territory, its roads, fortifications, settlements, mines, garrisons, and frontier defenses were no longer someone else's responsibility. They were Rome's. So the central question is not simply why Trajan conquered Dacia. It is why Rome's solution to the Dacian threat created a new frontier problem, and why that new problem remained valuable enough to sustain for generations, until the wider strategic conditions of the empire changed. To understand that transformation, we first have to understand why Dacia had become a problem Rome could no longer comfortably ignore. To understand why Rome eventually chose conquest, we have to start with geography. Dacia occupied the lands north of the lower Danube, with its core in the region of the Carpathian Mountains. That geography mattered because the Danube was not simply a river on a map. For Rome, it was one of the major organizing lines of imperial security. A power established beyond that river could remain outside direct Roman control while still affecting what happened along the frontier. And Dacia was not a weak power that happened to sit in the wrong place. During the 1st century BC, the Dacian kingdom had already demonstrated the ability to unify tribes and extend its influence across neighboring territories. Later, under Decebalus, the kingdom again became a substantial political and military force. The Romans recognized that Dacia was capable of organizing alliances, subjugating neighboring peoples, and maintaining fortified positions in difficult terrain. That last point is especially important. Dacia's mountains were not merely a source of natural resources. They also helped determine the military problem Rome faced. A kingdom based in defensible highlands could absorb pressure more effectively than a state exposed on an open plain. Its settlements and fortifications could be concentrated where Roman armies would have to move through difficult terrain. The result was a frontier problem that could not be reduced to one battle or one city. Rome could defeat a Dacian army. The harder question was whether Rome could force the Dacian state to accept a political arrangement that would remain stable after the Roman army went home. That distinction explains much of what happened before Trajan. Rome had already fought Dacia under Domitian. In 85 AD, Dacian forces attacked Roman Moesia and killed its governor. Rome responded with military campaigns of its own, including an expedition into Dacia in 87 that ended badly. Another campaign the following year achieved greater success, but broader pressures elsewhere prevented Rome from turning that victory into a final solution. The settlement that followed was therefore a compromise. Decebalus remained in power. Dacia remained outside the empire, but the kingdom was expected to operate within limits acceptable to Rome. It received Roman money and technical assistance, while Rome gained commitments intended to make the lower Danube more secure. In other words, Rome tried to solve the problem without annexing the country. That strategy made sense. Conquest was expensive. A Roman emperor did not have unlimited troops, unlimited money, or unlimited freedom to concentrate the army wherever he wanted. Rome had other frontiers, other enemies, and political problems of its own. Containment offered a cheaper alternative. Instead of occupying Dacia, Rome could try to influence it. Instead of paying for permanent military control over the kingdom, Rome could try to make the Dacian state itself perform part of the security function. That arrangement, however, depended on a critical assumption. Decebalus had to remain willing to operate inside the political boundaries Rome had established. And that was the weakness built into the system. During the years of relative peace, Decebalus did not simply wait for Rome to decide what happened next. He used the resources available to him to strengthen his own position. The fortified heartland of Dacia became more formidable, not less. This is where the logic of containment begins to break down. A buffer is useful when the state occupying it remains weaker than the power it is supposed to separate from the frontier. But if the buffer becomes more capable, the relationship changes. Rome had helped stabilize Dacia after the earlier war. Yet that stability also gave Decebalus time, resources, and expertise with which to reinforce the kingdom. The very arrangement designed to make Dacia manageable could therefore help preserve the Dacian state's ability to resist Roman pressure. That did not make war inevitable. It did, however, narrow Rome's options. By the time Trajan came to power, Rome had inherited a familiar strategic problem. Dacia was independent, militarily capable, geographically important, and difficult to control from a distance. There was also another complication. Dacia was valuable. The Carpathian region contained deposits of gold, silver, iron, copper, salt, and other resources. The economic attraction was real, especially for an empire whose finances had repeatedly been pressured by the cost of maintaining its military establishment. But resources alone do not explain conquest. Gold can make territory attractive. It does not automatically make annexation strategically necessary. The deeper issue was that Dacia combined several characteristics that mattered to Rome at the same time: strategic position, military capability, political independence, and economic value. That combination is what made Dacia difficult to ignore. Rome was not choosing between a worthless territory and a profitable one. It was choosing between different ways of managing a strategically important neighbor. And every option had a cost. Continue containment, and Rome would still have to rely on a Dacian regime whose interests did not perfectly align with its own. Escalate pressure, and Rome risked another war without eliminating the underlying problem. Conquer Dacia, and Rome could finally remove the independent kingdom from the strategic equation, but only by taking responsibility for the territory itself. That was the choice Trajan would face. And once that choice was made, the question would no longer be how Rome could contain Dacia. It would be how Rome could sustain the much larger system created by defeating it. Before Trajan decided to conquer Dacia, Rome had already tried another solution. It was not annexation, it was containment. That distinction matters because the Dacian Wars did not begin with Rome suddenly deciding that every threat beyond the Danube had to become a Roman province. The earlier Roman strategy was more limited. Weaken the threat, establish favorable political conditions, and leave the Dacian kingdom in place. Under Domitian, that strategy emerged from necessity. In 85 AD, Dacian forces crossed into Roman territory and attacked the province of Moesia. The Roman governor was killed, forcing Domitian to respond personally. The Roman army then attempted to take the war into Dacia. The first major expedition in 87 ended in disaster. A later campaign in 88 was more successful, but the wider strategic situation did not allow Domitian to concentrate indefinitely on Dacia. The result was a compromise. Decebalus remained king. Dacia was not annexed. Instead, Decebalus accepted an arrangement that placed limits on his foreign policy and military posture, while keeping his kingdom formally separate from the empire. Rome also provided substantial financial payments and access to specialists. In return, the Dacian king was expected to help keep the lower Danube secure and cooperate with Roman strategic interests. For Rome, the attraction was obvious. The empire could avoid the enormous administrative and military commitment required to occupy the Dacian heartland. For Decebalus, the arrangement offered something equally important. His kingdom survived. That meant both sides could describe the settlement as useful, at least in the short term. But containment has a built-in weakness. It works only when the interests of the contained state and the dominant power remain sufficiently aligned. Rome wanted a Dacia that was predictable, restrained, and incapable of becoming a serious threat to the Danube frontier. Decebalus wanted a Dacia that remained independent and capable of defending its own interests. Those goals overlapped only temporarily. The peace that followed was therefore not the same thing as a permanent strategic settlement. During the years that followed, Decebalus used the resources available to him to strengthen his kingdom. The Roman subsidies and technical specialists were not simply passive benefits. They could be converted into military capacity, including fortifications in Dacia's mountainous heartland. This created a dangerous feedback loop. Rome had used resources to stabilize Dacia. Dacia could use those resources to increase its ability to resist Rome. That did not mean Domitian had made an irrational decision. His government was operating under constraints that Trajan would not necessarily face in exactly the same form. Rome had other strategic pressures, and maintaining a semi-dependent neighboring kingdom could be cheaper than occupying it. The important point is that the arrangement did not remove the underlying strategic contradiction. Dacia remained independent. Rome still cared about what happened there, and both sides understood that the relationship was conditional. This is why the settlement should not be judged simply by what happened later. From the perspective of 89 AD, Rome had a practical reason to stop the fighting. A client or allied kingdom could serve as a buffer. It could absorb external pressure, reduce the need for permanent occupation, and allow Rome to concentrate military resources elsewhere. The problem was that Decebalus was not a Roman administrator wearing a foreign crown. He was still the ruler of an independent state. As long as that state retained its own army, diplomacy, and strategic interests, Rome could influence it but could not fully control it. That difference became increasingly important. A directly controlled province has clear chains of authority. A client kingdom does not. Its ruler can cooperate today and resist tomorrow. And once that ruler has strengthened his position, Rome must decide whether to tolerate the change, renegotiate the relationship, or intervene again. This was the structural weakness of the Dacian settlement. The Roman solution depended on indirect control, but indirect control preserved an independent political actor. And an independent political actor could change the strategic equation. The result was not an immediate return to war. The peace lasted for more than a decade. That duration itself matters. It shows that containment was not a meaningless policy or an instant failure. It produced a period of stability. But stability is not the same thing as resolution. Rome had created a workable arrangement without eliminating the reason it had entered the conflict in the first place. That distinction would become decisive after Nerva's short reign, when Trajan inherited the Roman throne. Trajan was entering a different political environment. He was a highly successful general, and military legitimacy mattered in an empire where the relationship between emperor and army was fundamental. A major foreign victory offered prestige, political legitimacy, and an opportunity to demonstrate that the new emperor could protect Roman interests where his predecessors had accepted compromise. But prestige alone was not enough to make a war strategically sustainable. Nor was Dacia's mineral wealth. The real issue was that the earlier containment model had left Rome facing the same fundamental question it had faced before. How could an independent Dacian kingdom remain compatible with Roman security? Trajan's answer was different from Domitian's. He would not try to make the existing Dacian state manageable. He would remove the state itself. That decision transformed the problem. Once Dacia was conquered, there would no longer be a Dacian king whose foreign policy Rome needed to monitor. There would be no separate kingdom to subsidize. There would be no need to ask whether Decebalus would comply with another treaty. Instead, Rome would have direct control. But direct control comes with a price that indirect influence does not. Once Rome takes responsibility for a territory, the territory's security becomes part of Rome's security. And that is the point at which the Dacian question changes from a problem of containment into a problem of sustainment. The next war would therefore do more than decide whether Trajan could defeat Decebalus. It would decide whether Rome was willing to replace an imperfect buffer with a permanent imperial commitment. By the beginning of Trajan's reign, the Dacian problem had become more than a dispute over one failed settlement. It was a question of what kind of frontier Rome was willing to maintain. The previous arrangement had preserved an independent Dacia while attempting to bind its ruler to Roman interests. That arrangement had worked for a time, but it had also left Rome dependent on the behavior of a foreign monarch whose interests were not identical to those of the empire. Trajan now had to decide whether that dependence was acceptable. There was no single factor that made the answer obvious. Dacia's military position mattered. Its geography mattered. The history of the previous conflict mattered. The resources of the region mattered. And the political position of the new emperor mattered too. The mistake is to rank these factors as though one of them automatically explains the entire war. The evidence does not require that kind of simplification. Dacia contained valuable deposits of gold, silver, iron, copper, and salt, and the region became an important source of mineral wealth after the Roman conquest. The economic attraction was therefore real. But a resource-rich neighbor is not automatically a military target, and modern scholarship cautions against treating gold as a sufficient explanation for Trajan's decision. The strategic question came first. Rome had already demonstrated that it was willing to use force against Dacia. Dacia had already demonstrated that it could survive Roman pressure. And the settlement that followed the earlier war had not transformed the relationship into one of complete Roman control. So Trajan inherited an awkward middle ground. Rome was powerful enough to defeat Dacia, but it was not yet prepared to accept the cost of permanently occupying the kingdom simply to remove every uncertainty on the frontier. That calculation changed with Trajan. The emperor had both the military capability and the political incentive to pursue a more decisive solution. Trajan had risen to the throne after Nerva's brief reign, and a major military victory could reinforce his legitimacy with the army and the wider Roman population. The earlier settlement with Decebalus had also carried a political stigma for Rome because it left the empire paying a powerful neighboring ruler rather than dictating terms from a position of complete control. Prestige therefore mattered. But prestige explains why a victory was attractive. It does not explain why conquest was the chosen strategic mechanism. For that, we have to look at the options. Trajan could attempt another negotiated arrangement. He could impose a harsher settlement and leave Decebalus on the throne. Or he could eliminate the independent Dacian state altogether. Each option solved a different part of the problem. Negotiation preserved the political structure that had already caused difficulties. A punitive settlement might weaken Dacia without removing the basic uncertainty. Conquest was different. It attacked the political source of the problem itself. If Decebalus could no longer rule an independent kingdom, Rome would no longer need to depend on his future choices. That was the strategic attraction of annexation. And it helps explain why Trajan did not simply repeat Domitian's policy. The objective was no longer to make Dacia cooperate. The objective was to make cooperation unnecessary. The First Dacian War began in 101 AD. Trajan's forces advanced into Dacia, and the campaign ended with a Roman victory. Decebalus was forced into a settlement that stripped away much of the military and diplomatic freedom he had previously possessed. His fortifications had to be dismantled, Roman specialists returned, and his foreign policy constrained. At first glance, the decision appeared to work. Rome had defeated Decebalus. The Dacian kingdom had been weakened. The immediate military problem seemed to be under control. But there was a contradiction inside the settlement.
Trajan wanted a permanent stratégique solution.
Decebalus had been forced into a temporary political submission. Those are not the same thing. A defeated ruler can accept unfavorable terms because refusing would be impossible in the short term. That does not mean he has accepted the strategic logic behind those terms. Decebalus therefore began rebuilding the military capacity that Rome had tried to destroy. He rearmed. He strengthened his fortifications. And by 105 AD, the two sides were at war again. This sequence matters because it exposes the difference between military victory and strategic resolution. Trajan had already demonstrated that Rome could defeat the Dacian army. The first victory had not demonstrated that Rome could maintain a stable Dacia without direct control. That distinction pushed the Second War toward a much more radical outcome. The objective was no longer simply to punish Decebalus or force another treaty. It was to capture the center of Dacian political power itself. The second campaign targeted Sarmizegetusa, the Dacian capital and core of the kingdom's political and defensive system. In 106 AD, Roman forces captured and destroyed the city. Decebalus escaped the initial destruction but eventually faced capture and took his own life. The independent Dacian kingdom was finished. And that was the moment when Trajan's decision achieved its immediate strategic objective. Rome had removed the political actor that had made the previous containment strategy unstable. There would be no third treaty with Decebalus. No renewed subsidy arrangement. No independent Dacian foreign policy. No Dacian kingdom waiting for an opportunity to rebuild. Instead, Rome annexed the conquered territory and created the province of Dacia. The map had changed. But more importantly, the nature of Roman responsibility had changed. Before the conquest, Rome could ask whether a Dacian ruler would remain compliant. After the conquest, Rome had to ask whether Roman institutions could keep the territory secure. That was an entirely different question. The conquest had therefore solved the first problem. It had eliminated Dacia as an independent strategic actor. But it had also created a second problem that could not be solved by another treaty. Rome now owned the answer. And once Rome owned the territory, Rome also owned its defense. The conquest of Dacia had achieved something the earlier settlement could not. Rome now controlled the territory directly. That changed the strategic equation immediately. The independent Dacian kingdom had disappeared, and with it the political structure that had forced Rome to negotiate with an external ruler. Instead of managing a neighboring power, Rome could impose its own administration, deploy its own troops, and organize the territory according to imperial requirements. But before we examine the cost of that achievement, we have to understand why Rome considered it worth doing in the first place. Because Dacia did not become a burden simply because Rome conquered it. It became a burden only if the obligations created by conquest eventually outweighed the advantages of direct control. And initially, those advantages were substantial. The first was strategic. Roman control pushed the imperial frontier beyond the Danube and placed the former Dacian heartland inside the Roman military system. Rome no longer had to watch an independent Dacian kingdom from across the river and wonder what its ruler might do next. The territory itself became part of the imperial defensive network. That meant roads could be constructed or reorganized for Roman purposes. Fortifications could be integrated into a Roman military system. Garrisons could be placed where Roman commanders considered them most useful. Administration could be imposed directly rather than negotiated through a local king. This was a fundamental change in the logic of the frontier. Before 106, the Danube separated Rome from Dacia. After 106, the Roman frontier had moved beyond part of that river system. The empire had gained strategic depth, but it had also changed the geometry of its defense. The second advantage was economic. Dacia's mineral wealth was one of the reasons the territory was attractive. The Carpathian region contained deposits of gold, silver, iron, copper, and salt, and Roman control allowed those resources to be incorporated into the imperial economy. The scale of the resources became part of the historical memory of the conquest. Later sources describe enormous quantities of gold and silver entering Roman hands after the defeat of Decebalus. Modern estimates differ substantially, which is why those figures need to be treated as estimates rather than as precise accounting records. The broader point, however, is much less controversial. The conquest gave Rome access to significant economic resources and helped support major imperial construction and spending. That distinction matters. We do not need an exact number to understand the mechanism. Rome gained control over a territory whose resources had previously been outside direct Roman extraction. The third advantage was administrative. After conquest, Rome did not simply leave the old kingdom intact and place a Roman flag over it. The imperial government reorganized the territory. New settlements were established. Existing settlements were incorporated into the Roman system or replaced where necessary. Roads, military installations, administrative centers, and urban infrastructure connected the province to the wider empire. Under Trajan, the new provincial capital at Ulpia Traiana Sarmizegetusa developed into a major Roman center. The province also acquired the name Dacia Felix, reflecting the imperial ambition to turn the conquered territory into a productive and stable component of the Roman world. This was not merely symbolism. A province generates value differently from a client kingdom. A client kingdom can provide tribute, cooperation, intelligence, military assistance, or political access while retaining its own institutions. A province can be taxed, administered, settled, and integrated directly into imperial structures. That was the transformation Trajan had purchased through conquest. The Roman state was no longer negotiating over how Dacia should behave. Rome was reorganizing Dacia so that its institutions would serve Roman purposes. This also explains why the conquest cannot reasonably be described as an immediate strategic mistake. For decades afterward, Roman emperors continued to invest in Dacia. The province was defended. Its infrastructure expanded. Its mines were worked. Its population was integrated into the Roman system. And its military position remained important enough that successive emperors continued to devote resources to it. If the conquest had produced nothing but cost, that continued investment would be difficult to explain. The reality was more complicated. Dacia could produce value. Dacia could also improve Rome's strategic position. The problem was that all of those benefits depended on one condition. Rome had to remain capable of holding the province. This is where the meaning of conquest begins to change. A resource becomes an imperial advantage only when the state can access it. A province becomes strategic depth only when the state can defend it. A road becomes military infrastructure only when the army can keep it open. A fortified position becomes useful only when the state can supply and reinforce the troops occupying it. In other words, territorial acquisition does not automatically convert land into power. The Roman government had to build a system capable of turning possession into sustained capability. And that system had a price. The more deeply Rome integrated Dacia, the more difficult it became to treat the province as optional. Once cities, mines, roads, garrisons, administrators, and settlers were established, abandoning the province would no longer mean merely withdrawing an army from a temporary battlefield. It would mean dismantling part of an imperial system. This is the hidden transformation inside the conquest. The first stage was military, defeat Dacia. The second was political, replace the Dacian kingdom with Roman rule. The third was economic, connect the province to the imperial economy. But the fourth stage was unavoidable, defend everything that had been built. The conquest therefore created a reciprocal relationship. The more Rome gained from Dacia, the more Rome had a reason to keep Dacia. And the more Rome invested in keeping Dacia, the greater the commitment required to protect those investments. This was not necessarily a contradiction. For much of the 2nd century, the calculation could still work. The province generated revenue. It supplied strategic advantages. It occupied a region that Roman leaders considered important. And the empire possessed enough military capacity to sustain it. Under those conditions, the obligation was acceptable. The frontier had expanded, but the Roman state had the means to support the expansion. This is why the eventual abandonment of Dacia cannot simply be projected backward onto Trajan's decision. A decision is made under a particular strategic environment. What matters is whether the resources available to the state justify the obligations it accepts. In Trajan's period, Rome could make the calculation in favor of conquest. The empire had the military capacity to defeat Dacia, organize the new province, and defend it. The conquest therefore solved a real problem and produced real benefits. But it also created a recurring requirement that the earlier containment strategy had avoided. Rome now had to keep an exposed province secure, and that meant Dacia's value could never be measured only by what its mines produced or what its conquest achieved. Its value had to be measured against the military system required to keep it. That is the obligation Trajan inherited from his own victory, and eventually it would become the decisive question. The most important consequence of conquering Dacia was not the gold. It was the obligation to defend what Rome had acquired. Before the conquest, Rome could treat Dacia as a separate political problem. Roman armies might campaign against it, Roman diplomats might negotiate with its ruler, and Roman subsidies might be used to influence its behavior. After 106, that flexibility disappeared. Dacia was now Roman territory, and Roman territory had to be defended by Roman institutions. This sounds obvious, but it fundamentally changed the military problem. A state can tolerate a hostile neighbor in a way that it cannot tolerate hostile forces inside its own province. A client kingdom can be pressured, subsidized, threatened, or isolated. A province requires garrisons. It requires roads. It requires fortified positions. It requires supply. And it requires a chain of command capable of responding when the frontier is threatened. The Romans therefore had to construct a military system appropriate to the territory they had just conquered. That system did not emerge because Dacia was inherently impossible to hold. It emerged because Roman control had created something that had not existed before: a permanent imperial frontier inside the former Dacian kingdom. The geography made this particularly important. Dacia's core lay among the Carpathian Mountains, where elevated terrain and fortified settlements had helped the independent kingdom resist Roman pressure. The same geography that had made Dacia difficult to conquer now shaped the way Rome had to defend it. Rome could not simply win the capital and assume the territory had become secure. A conquered region becomes stable only when military control can be extended beyond the battlefield. That requires infrastructure. It requires troops to move. It requires commanders to know where those troops are needed. And it requires the state to maintain the system when no major battle is taking place. This distinction explains why the second half of the Dacian story matters more than the final Roman victory itself. The conquest was an event. The occupation was a system. Trajan therefore had to transform the former kingdom into an administratively and militarily functioning province. Roman cities were developed. Military installations were established. Roads connected strategic locations. Fortifications helped organize the defensive network. And the province became tied into the broader Roman military structure along the Danube. Each of those measures solved a practical problem. A road reduced the time required to move troops and supplies. A fortification gave soldiers a protected position from which they could monitor and respond to threats. A permanent garrison reduced the need to improvise a defense every time an enemy appeared. Administrative organization allowed taxes, manpower, supplies, and information to move through the province. None of these mechanisms was spectacular on its own. Together, they made Roman control possible. That is why the phrase "Rome conquered Dacia" hides so much of the real history. The conquest established political control. It did not automatically establish governability. Those are different achievements. A Roman commander could capture a fortress in a campaign. The imperial government had to maintain that fortress year after year. The army could defeat an enemy force. The state then had to feed, pay, reinforce, and rotate the soldiers who remained behind. And the governor could issue Roman orders. Those orders still had to function across difficult terrain and through a newly reorganized provincial society. The problem was therefore not simply military strength. It was military administration. This is one reason the Dacian province remained important under later emperors. The Romans did not immediately treat it as a temporary possession. Defensive systems were strengthened, the mining regions received military attention, and the province continued to receive imperial resources. The transcript records additional defensive investments under later emperors, including the strengthening of the limes Transalutnus. That continued investment tells us something important. Rome was not discovering that Dacia had been worthless. Quite the opposite. The empire kept paying to maintain control because the province still offered enough strategic and economic value to justify the commitment. This is where the relationship between resources and military power becomes complicated. Dacia's mines generated wealth, but wealth does not defend a frontier by itself. The state had to transform revenue into military capability. That meant paying soldiers, building infrastructure, maintaining fortifications, moving supplies, supporting administrators, and responding to threats that could emerge outside the province itself. The same principle applies to territory. A province can provide strategic depth, but a province can also increase the distance that an empire must defend. Before conquest, the Danube could function as a major defensive reference point. After conquest, Rome had extended its position beyond that river. The empire had gained ground, but every additional kilometer of frontier had to be watched, supplied, and defended. That is the structural trade-off at the heart of Roman Dacia. Expansion can make an empire stronger. Expansion can also make the empire responsible for a larger perimeter. And the larger the perimeter becomes, the more important military capacity becomes relative to the value of any individual territory. This is why we should be careful with the phrase, the cost of Dacia. There was no single bill that Rome could calculate after the conquest. The cost was recurring. It existed every year the province remained part of the empire. Every garrison represented a continuing commitment. Every road and fortification required maintenance. Every crisis elsewhere in the empire forced Roman commanders to consider whether troops in Dacia could be moved, or whether moving them would expose the province. That final problem would become increasingly important as the empire encountered pressure on multiple fronts. A strong empire can afford some redundancy, can maintain forces in several regions at once. A strategically pressured empire has fewer options. Troops sent to one frontier cannot simultaneously reinforce another. Ships, roads, supplies, money, and commanders are all finite. This means the military value of a province cannot be separated from the wider strategic environment. Dacia could be worth defending when Rome had the capacity to defend it. The same territory could become difficult to justify when the empire needed those resources elsewhere. That was not unique to Dacia, but Dacia exposed the principle particularly clearly because the province sat beyond the Danube and therefore existed inside a difficult frontier configuration. The Roman decision had created a new dependency. The province depended on Rome for security, but Rome also depended on its military system to keep the province secure. That produced a feedback loop. Investment made Dacia more valuable. Higher value created stronger incentives to defend it. Stronger incentives justified further investment. And the larger the Roman military commitment became, the more painful withdrawal would eventually become. For much of the 2nd century, this cycle remained manageable. Dacia could be defended. Its resources could be exploited, the settlements could be integrated, and the empire could continue to allocate enough military power to sustain the province. So the conquest was not a simple case of Rome winning territory that it could barely hold. The better interpretation is more precise. Rome had created a new military obligation, and for generations the empire possessed enough capacity to carry it. The strategic problem came later, when the balance between value and obligation began to change. And that brings us to the most important question in the entire story. If Dacia remained useful for generations, why did Rome eventually abandon it? The answer cannot simply be that the province was a mistake. We have to look at what happened to the empire around it, because the real test of a frontier is not whether it can survive in favorable conditions. It is whether the state can still afford to defend it when several problems arrive at once. For much of the 2nd century, the Roman presence in Dacia remained sustainable. That point is essential. If the conquest had immediately produced an intolerable burden, Rome would not have continued investing in the province for generations. Instead, successive emperors maintained its defenses, supported its administration, and continued to benefit from its economic and strategic position. Dacia remained a functioning part of the Roman Empire long after Trajan had died. So the real problem was not that Dacia was inherently impossible to hold. The problem was that the strategic environment surrounding Dacia did not remain fixed. An empire's frontier system works only within the limits of the resources available to support it. As long as Rome could maintain sufficient troops, infrastructure, administration, and political cohesion, the province could remain valuable. But Rome was not defending Dacia in isolation. The empire had multiple frontiers. Every army, every commander, and every supply network had competing demands. That meant the strategic value of Dacia had to be considered relative to the pressures emerging elsewhere. This became increasingly important during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and the conflicts that followed. The Danube region experienced repeated military pressure, and Dacia was not simply an isolated province sitting safely behind a permanent Roman shield. It remained tied to a wider frontier environment in which Germanic and Sarmatian groups could threaten Roman territory and communications. The Roman response was not immediate withdrawal. It was adaptation. Defenses were reinforced. Military resources were allocated to protect important areas. Dacia continued to function as part of the imperial strategic system. This is another reason not to read the later history backward. The fact that Rome eventually abandoned Dacia does not prove that Trajan's original decision was irrational. It shows that the same territory can have different strategic value under different conditions. In one period, a province can be worth the troops required to defend it. In another, those same troops may be needed somewhere else. That is the deeper systems problem. Military capacity is finite. A frontier does not consume resources only when an army is fighting. It consumes resources simply by existing. Soldiers must be stationed there. Roads must be maintained. Supplies must be delivered. Fortifications must remain functional. Command structures must remain active. And when a crisis occurs, reinforcements have to move toward the threatened sector. The farther and more fragmented an empire's frontier becomes, the more difficult these decisions become. Dacia therefore created what might be called a permanent strategic dependency. Once Rome had incorporated the province, withdrawing troops was no longer a neutral action. It changed the security of Roman territory. Any reduction in military presence could expose settlements, mines, roads, or neighboring regions. The empire had to weigh those risks against threats elsewhere. This becomes clearer during the crisis of the 3rd century. Rome entered a period of extraordinary instability. Emperors changed rapidly. Civil wars competed with external invasions. Armies were repeatedly redirected. Political authority became more fragile, while multiple frontier zones demanded attention at the same time. The problem was therefore larger than Dacia, and that distinction matters. It would be historically misleading to say that Dacia caused the crisis. The province was one component inside a much larger imperial system under pressure. But the crisis changed the calculation Rome had to make. A territory that had been affordable under one strategic environment could become a liability under another. The Roman government now had fewer options. It could not simply assume that every frontier could receive the same level of protection forever. Commanders had to prioritize. Troops had to be concentrated where the danger was greatest. And provinces that had once been sustainable could become increasingly difficult to reinforce. Dacia's geographical position made this calculation especially difficult. The province extended Roman control beyond the Danube, but that advantage came with exposure. The surrounding regions remained politically unstable. The Carpathian landscape could make movement difficult, and any serious threat required the Romans to coordinate forces across a frontier that was more complicated than the simple image of a river line on a map suggests. The result was a paradox. The conquest had originally been attractive because direct control offered greater strategic security. But direct control also meant that Rome could no longer outsource the security of the region to an independent Dacian state. That was the military obligation created by victory. Under strong imperial conditions, it was manageable. Under severe imperial stress, it became harder to sustain. This is why the later history of Dacia should be understood as a test of Roman state capacity. Could Rome continue to transform economic resources and political control into military security? Could it maintain enough manpower to defend the province while also meeting demands elsewhere? Could the empire preserve the roads, forts, administration, and communications necessary to make territorial control meaningful? For a long time, the answer was yes. Eventually, the answer changed. And when it changed, the Roman government did not need to prove that Dacia had no value. It only needed to decide that the empire could no longer justify spending the necessary military capacity to retain it. That is a very different proposition from saying that conquest had been a mistake. It means the strategic environment had crossed a threshold. The cost of maintaining the solution had become harder to reconcile with the empire's remaining options. By the 3rd century, the pressure was becoming visible across the Roman frontier system. Dacia suffered attacks and raids, while the wider imperial military structure struggled with overextension and repeated crises. Roman control over parts of the province weakened, and the territory became increasingly difficult to defend as the empire's resources were stretched across several directions. This is the moment when the logic of the conquest comes full circle. Trajan had chosen annexation because indirect control left Rome facing an independent Dacian power. 3 generations later, Rome faced the opposite problem. The independent Dacian state was gone, but the territory remained. And now Rome had to decide whether that territory still justified the military system required to keep it. The original strategic question had been, how do we control Dacia? The later question became, how much of the empire can we still afford to defend? Those are not the same question. And the difference between them explains why a successful conquest could eventually end in withdrawal. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman problem was no longer whether Dacia had value. It was whether Rome still possessed the capacity to defend every part of the empire that had value. That distinction is the key to understanding the eventual abandonment of Roman Dacia. The province had survived for generations. Its resources remained useful. Its strategic position still mattered. Roman forces had repeatedly adapted their defenses when the frontier came under pressure. But the empire around it was changing. The crisis of the 3rd century placed extraordinary demands on the Roman military and political system. External attacks multiplied, internal conflicts diverted armies, and imperial authority became increasingly unstable. In that environment, every frontier had to compete for the same limited resources. Dacia was not uniquely responsible for the crisis. It was one component of a much larger system under stress. That distinction matters because the easiest story would be to say that Trajan conquered Dacia, discovered that it was too expensive to hold, and eventually abandoned it. The historical process was more complicated. For roughly a century and a half, Rome demonstrated that it could hold the province. The issue was therefore not absolute impossibility. It was changing strategic priorities. As the pressure on the empire increased, maintaining a distant province beyond the Danube became more difficult to justify against other military demands. Roman control in Dacia weakened during the 3rd century as invasions and raids increased and the broader Roman army became increasingly stretched. The transcript describes a situation in which imperial control became increasingly nominal before Aurelian ordered the withdrawal of Roman forces and administration. That withdrawal was a major decision, because by this point, Rome was not abandoning an empty military outpost. It was abandoning an integrated province. The decision therefore carried real costs. Rome lost access to territory containing gold, silver, copper, iron, salt, and agricultural resources. It also lost a substantial section of frontier territory north of the Danube. And politically, withdrawal meant accepting that territory once considered worth conquering could no longer be defended under the empire's prevailing conditions. But those costs do not prove that the original conquest had been irrational. They reveal something more important about imperial strategy. A strategic asset has value only relative to the resources required to preserve it. Trajan had evaluated Dacia in one environment. Aurelian evaluated it in another. The territory had not magically changed from valuable to worthless. The empire's capacity had changed. That is why the decision to withdraw can be understood as a strategic reallocation rather than simply a military defeat. The Roman government had to choose where its remaining forces could have the greatest effect. Holding Dacia required troops. Those troops could not simultaneously reinforce every other threatened frontier. Maintaining the province required communications and infrastructure. Those systems also depended on an imperial state capable of protecting them. And protecting them required a political and military structure that was itself under severe pressure. At some point, the calculation changed. The territory was still valuable. But value alone was no longer enough. The cost of maintaining it had become too high relative to the empire's other strategic needs. Aurelian therefore ordered the withdrawal of Roman troops and civilian administration from Dacia around 274. The decision did not erase the legacy of the conquest. It demonstrated its full strategic cycle. Trajan had begun with an external security problem. Rome had responded by eliminating the independent Dacian kingdom. The empire then created a province. The province generated economic and strategic benefits. Those benefits justified continued military investment. But the existence of the province also created a permanent military obligation. And when imperial capacity deteriorated badly enough, that obligation became difficult to sustain. The Roman state eventually chose to give up the territory rather than consume resources required for the survival of the wider empire. That was not the same as admitting that conquest had never made sense. In fact, the opposite may be closer to the historical reality. The conquest could be rational under one set of conditions and unsustainable under another. This is an important distinction because empires are often judged as though every territorial decision has a permanent answer. It does not. The strategic value of territory changes with the strength of the state, the number of competing threats, the cost of maintaining the frontier, the availability of manpower, the reliability of communications, and the political ability to coordinate those resources. Dacia had once justified the commitment. Later, the empire could no longer make the same calculation. The most revealing part of the story is therefore not that Rome eventually left. It is why Rome stayed for so long before leaving. For generations, The province produced enough strategic and economic value to justify its defense. That means the conquest had achieved something real. It had removed an independent rival. It had expanded Roman control. It had opened access to resources. It had reshaped the Danube frontier. And it had remained sustainable under emperors who possessed enough military capacity to support it. The eventual withdrawal does not erase those achievements. What it reveals is the second-order consequence of conquest. Once Rome transformed Dacia from a foreign kingdom into a Roman province, the empire could no longer judge the region only by whether it was worth conquering. It had to judge whether it was worth maintaining. That is a much harder calculation. And it is the calculation that eventually changed the map. The conquest had succeeded. The system built around that conquest had also succeeded for a long time. But no military system is permanent. When the surrounding conditions changed, Rome had to reconsider the obligation it had created. And that brings us back to the original question. Why did Rome's solution to the Dacian threat create a new frontier problem? Because conquest changed the object of Roman strategy. Rome had once been trying to manage a neighboring kingdom. After Trajan, Rome had to manage the consequences of owning it. The first problem could be solved by diplomacy, subsidies, coercion, or war. The second required permanent administration and defense. And permanent obligations become dangerous not when they are always too expensive, but when an empire loses the capacity that once made them affordable. The easiest way to remember the history of Roman Dacia is as a sequence of events. Trajan invaded. Decebalus resisted. Rome won. Dacia became a province. The province prospered.
Laté, Rome withdrew.
But that chronology misses the deeper story. The real transformation was not simply that Rome conquered more territory. It was that the conquest changed the problem Rome had to solve. Before Trajan, Dacia was an independent political and military power. Rome could pressure it. Rome could negotiate with it. Rome could punish it. Rome could attempt to contain it. All of those options preserved one important fact. Dacia remained responsible for defending itself. After the conquest, that was no longer true. Rome had absorbed the territory. The problem of an independent Dacian kingdom had been removed, but the responsibility for the territory had been transferred directly to the Roman state. That created a new chain of obligations. Control required administration. Administration required infrastructure. Infrastructure required protection. Protection required troops. Troops required money, supplies, communications, and political decisions about where imperial resources should be concentrated. The conquest therefore did exactly what Trajan intended. It removed the Dacian state from the strategic equation. But removing one actor did not make the system simpler. It changed who was responsible for the system. That is why the later history of Dacia should not be reduced to the phrase Rome conquered it and then lost it. Rome held Dacia for generations. The province was economically useful. It had strategic importance. Its defenses were maintained and adapted. Its population and institutions were integrated into the Roman world. The eventual withdrawal came only after the strategic environment of the empire had changed dramatically. By then, the question was no longer whether Dacia could theoretically be defended. Roman forces had demonstrated that they could defend it for a very long time. The question was whether the empire could continue allocating the necessary capacity to Dacia while facing increasingly severe problems elsewhere. That distinction gives the conquest a very different meaning. Trajan was not necessarily choosing between a good strategy and a bad one. He was choosing between imperfect options under the conditions of his own time. Containment had preserved an independent power that Rome considered difficult to control. Conquest eliminated that power but created a permanent imperial commitment. For generations, the benefits justified the commitment. Eventually, the balance changed. And when it did, Rome had to abandon part of the system that an earlier emperor had built. There is a broader lesson here. Military power is not measured only by how much territory a state can capture. It is also measured by how much territory that state can continue to secure after the campaign ends. A conquest changes the map in a single decision. Maintaining the new map is a recurring decision. That is why capture is not sustainment. And that is why resources are not the same thing as military capability. Dacia could provide wealth. But wealth had to be converted into soldiers, infrastructure, administration, and logistics. The province could provide strategic depth. But strategic depth had to be defended. The Roman Empire solved the Dacian problem by making Dacia Roman. In doing so, it exchanged one type of uncertainty for another. The uncertainty of an independent rival became the obligation of permanent control. That obligation was manageable for a long time. It became untenable only when the wider imperial system could no longer support it. So the story of Dacia is not really the story of a conquest that turned out to be a mistake. It is the story of a successful strategic decision whose consequences lasted long enough to be tested by a completely different Roman Empire. Trajan solved the problem he inherited. Later emperors inherited the problem created by his solution. And when the empire could no longer afford the same strategic commitment, the answer changed. That is the deeper lesson of Roman Dacia. The hardest part of conquest is not winning the territory. It is living with the strategic reality that victory creates.